Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We've been covering what has been taking place in Ethiopia over the course of the last several months, and that has been the conflict between the TPLF and the Ethiopian government. The Ethiopian government has been working with Eritrea in regards to this conflict. You've had Joe Biden, you've had members of the United States government basically coming out saying that Ethiopia needs to withdraw. This has been a really interesting and heartfelt conflict. Many of the people we've had on have been Ethiopian and have talked about it in these kind of pained ways. I've had people who were close or friends of mine who are Ethiopian who also, again, talks about it in pained ways. However, with the caveat that the ethnic cleansing is not happening, or that what is happening are the TPLF assuming the military garb of the Ethiopian government in order to frame the government. It's interesting, and we have a great guest, and this guest found us in order to have a larger conversation about this, to get a different perspective on what is occurring right now in Ethiopia. The guest we have is George Kadane. George Kadane co-created the English news startup Zena Netsnet that covers news, opinion, and issues related to Eritrea and the wider Horn of the African region. George, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for reaching out, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.
So what made you want to reach out? Now, we've had coverage of the Ethiopian conflict. And like I said, many of the people who came on, they were Ethiopian, or one person came on was Ethiopian, and talking about it from this kind of personal experience of family and so forth, and saying, look, this conflict is painful. It's a civil conflict of sorts. And within the context of that, trying to work through the issues and work through what's taken place. Eritrea has been brought into this as being an assistance to Ethiopia in, let's say, the conflict against the TPLF. So in our coverage of this, what made you reach out, and what did you want to try to communicate in that reaching out?
First of all, thank you for giving me the platform to speak about this issue. I think it's something that the international community needs to be pressing both Ethiopia and Eritrea much more significantly. As an Eritrean, these matters are relevant to me because it's in Eritrea's best interest to stop enabling the president and his regime to export their, what I'd call decades-long domestic oppression into other places. Isaias Afwerki, who is the president, has, since independence in 1991, allowed a culture of repressive and autocratic authority to rule the country. And we see today in Tigray that his security interests have been emboldened both by the government in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, also within his own political clique, to strengthen or to legitimize his campaign in Tigray. It's relevant to bring up some of the modern or the contemporary history of the region because it is important to understand what's happening. The TPLF, from the Eritrean perspective, has been a friend and foe at times. Initially, they fought against the communist Derg regime in the 1970s and 80s in order to overthrow the government of Mengistu Haile Mariam, and they worked with the Eritrean government at the time, the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, and they had some amicable relations then. But in the time since, we've seen, at least from the Eritrean perspective, a degeneration of the relationship between Eritreans and Tigrayans, and I would place much of the responsibility of this on Isaias Afwerki, who led the liberation, or one of the leaders of the liberation struggle, and saw the TPLF and Tigray as a security threat, in his opinion, because he wants a hegemonic or an overarching, a domineering influence in the Horn of Africa. Of course, I feel terrible seeing Tigrayans being massacred in this brutalist manner, and we see today the widespread atrocities, including rape and sexual abuses against women, sodomization, the looting of historical sites, including religious.
Let me ask you this. Ethiopia says that's not happening, meaning they would say, or people who are Ethiopians, especially people who I talk to, they would say that, no, we're not doing that. That's people framing us, or that's people trying to say that for these kind of political reasons.
That's the TPLF specifically
right.
framing them.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the argument.
That's the argument. That it's the TPLF that's basically pretending to be the Ethiopian army, to frame the Ethiopian army. What is your take on that, by the way?
Well, it would be a position that I would look into with a healthy dose of skepticism. Ever since November, the Ethiopian government has deliberately shut off the region. They haven't allowed any media to come into Tigray. They haven't allowed any NGOs to open up a humanitarian corridor. It's very interesting to see the Ethiopian government deny all these claims and allegations of atrocities, understanding their position relative to the region, because they are a federal government. They are, to an extent, responsible for whatever happens in the country, and they have utilized the problematic history of the TPLF in a way to set themselves as the protagonist, so to speak. They've been able to convince many Ethiopians and Eritreans that it is a just war, and that's just not true.
Well, okay, so George,
yeah.
two things to add in here. Abiy Ahmed won the Nobel Peace Prize specifically for achieving, and again, this was, it came too early, but for achieving what it seemed at the time was a humanitarian resolution to, a decades-long conflict that has now reasserted itself. But who reasserted it? It seems like the TPLF launched the hostilities last year, and so from that sort of simple analysis or that simple summary of it, what's wrong? Because it would seem like a just war if Abiy Ahmed comes in, ends things peacefully, and then the TPLF with its independent military and its militia force starts things back up, starts those hostilities back up last year, simply as an attempt to get back into power, even though Abiy Ahmed won that election. What's wrong with that narrative, George?
Two main things. First, the TPLF really messed up. They really were in the driver's seat going into the 2015 elections, and in one of what is called probably the most rigged election of that time, they lost the hope of the constituency. The trust was broken, and they sought regime change. They are not innocent in this at all. And they were actually plotting to an effect to destabilize the country. Unfortunately, the response to that when Prime Minister Abiy was elected was to fight fire with fire and essentially democratize the country in his image, which was more of a unitarian system of government. This clash that we're seeing today is really a battle between the visions of how Ethiopia should be ruled. For decades, it's been through a decentralized ethnic federalist system, which hasn't really worked out. And the regime former to what we're seeing today has not done a good job.
Well, from my understanding, the TPLF and the regime former basically raped the country blind in the way that it's been described to me by multiple people who are Ethiopians. And what was he to do? Now, so it's not, this is rah-rah ethnic cleansing. It's not that. I guess what I'm asking is, the group that had been in power for decades had decided that it was going to regain power. It had the military equipment and hardware to do it. It had the interest and intent to do it. It was believed that they were going to do it. This is the same group that was at war with, basically, or was in power during the war with Eritrea. So what was Abiy Ahmed to do in this situation? If you get my point, this is not, again, a rah-rah war, not rah-rah ethnic cleansing, none of that. But it is something to be said that there's due diligence and taking precautions into ensuring that your country is not overthrown and to rooting out what he considered to be a credible military threat. From your take, what should he have done?
Well, he certainly has the constitutional mandate, the position in which he was put into power. He was responsible for establishing peace between the regional government in Tigray and the federal government, and to make sure that going forward, the system of government which would rule the country would do so in a way which would not provoke or incite any further violence. Unfortunately, part of the peace deal was getting Eritrea involved, and I think that was a very serious mistake that Abiy made, because he knew that there was a contention that existed between the TPLF and the president of Eritrea and the regime. They fought a very serious, bloody civil war over the border area between Eritrea and Tigray that lasted between 1998 and 2000, which left almost 4% of the Eritrean population dead. And since then, the Eritrean president has utilized that border conflict as an excuse to turn the country essentially into an authoritarian state. Citizens are conscripted into the mandatory national service indefinitely, and they've used this as propaganda to essentially brutalize the TPLF. Why is this history relevant to the conflict in Ethiopia? When Abiy became the prime minister, the Eritrean president sensed that for the first time that there was a real shift in power. Even though the TPLF was part of a coalition within the broader party, the EPRDF, the president of Eritrea saw that if he could manipulate or somehow influence, probably is a more accurate term, the Ethiopian government into first securing his own security interests, but also to establish decorum from his perspective of how Ethiopia should be run, then the president would have more of a overarching influence in Ethiopia and in Eritrea. He has had a long-standing vision of becoming the major player in the Horn of Africa. He is one of the longest-serving leaders in the continent, and he initially sought support from other countries, including Somalia, with President Formaggio, and with the then dictator Omar al-Bashir in Sudan before the uprising in April 2019. So there is contemporary history to understand with regard to how the conflict in Ethiopia first arose, because there is a system of government which is in question, but also who are the players within the region, which is pretty important to take note.
And so it sounds like, George, it sounds like you're coming to this as a self-identified Eritrean who's looking at the things that the government there is doing and is very disappointed with the trend towards authoritarianism and using the war, using what happened back in between 1998 and 2000 as justification, as a kind of resentment and, revanchism, that kind of thing, for doing all of this, increasing the level of his control over the country there. And it seems like you're a dissident against his governance in generally, against his administration. Is that right, George?
Definitely. Isaias Afwerki was never elected to be the president of Eritrea. He established that position through the context that he was one of the leaders of the liberation movement. And so, in his view, it gave him the carte blanche, so to say, to rule the country. And unfortunately, I don't think the voices of opposition at the time were empowered really to stand up to Isaias, because in my personal view, he has really fueled the fire behind us. Abiy, I think, has been a useful idiot, or probably a puppet of what Isaias seems to perceive as his own interest. Because before Abiy came to power, Ethiopia had a very antagonistic view against Eritrea as an entity, but also as an influence.
But that was also under TPLF rule, of course. That's the side of that, is that was all Ethiopia, again, as the TPLF, in this, more ethnically, and this was something I want to get into with you while we still have you, George, in this more ethnically driven state. Again, if you have one ethnic group ruling over the others, and if that ethnic group is a minority, that kind of reminds me of the wake of colonialism and what happened to all these other countries after they were freed from explicit colonial rule, or what you basically had, an extension from colonialism. You had an ethnic minority being put at the top of a hierarchy over other larger ethnic majorities in a given region or country, which seems to have been exactly what happened with the TPLF. Not saying that they came into power at the immediate hands of colonists or anything like that, but it seems to be like they're living in the wake of that. How much of the conflict between the Eritreans and the Tigrayans is explicitly politically driven, based on their slogans and their parties, and how much of it is deeper ethnic resentment, George?
Well, to the first point, it's pretty easy to understand why the TPLF had such a dominant influence in Ethiopia. When the overthrow of Mengistu Haile Mariam commenced in 1990 and later 1991, the TPLF were the most trained, the most organized, the most militarized of all the ethnic groups. Of course, you include the Amharas, the Oromos, other nationalities and ethnicities, but the TPLF were the most organized. They really also had a geographic advantage because they were good at training in the mountains. So that's the first point. They shouldn't have abused that power, but unfortunately they did, and it led to severe ethnic conflict, which they are responsible in fueling. But to the second point with regard to Eritrea and Tigray, fueling their own interests with regard to political capital in the Horn of Africa, both Eritrea and Tigray have an interest in securing their position, and they are both afraid that if their current government structure were to fall, that a vacuum would develop and people would just vie for power with no regard to the law that was set before them. I think it's more volatile in Eritrea because the government has existed since its independence. At least in Tigray, there has been some sort of internal opposition, although it doesn't really come to fruition. But in Eritrea, it is very
absolutist
edge, so to speak.
Okay, I think I understand what you're saying. You're basically saying that the people who won liberation didn't have opposition in winning the liberation, and so the government kind of is creaking, or the political system is creaking. Whereas in Ethiopia, there was a changeover in political power. Somebody was elected. Is that the point that you're trying to make with this?
Yes, there is a semblance of democracy in Ethiopia relative to Eritrea.
So I want to get into public perception of both in Eritrea and Ethiopia, but I also want to get into public perception within the context of the U.S., meaning the U.S. has started to put pressure on Ethiopia and Eritrea in this conflict, basically saying to leave the Tigray region. Some Ethiopians have basically said that the relationships that were forged between the TPLF and, let's say, neighbors or the United States is the reason for that. And it's for the reason, that reason is the reason they're taking this kind of bias, quote unquote, take on this issue. What is the public perception of this at home in Eritrea and Ethiopia? And how is, what do you think the U.S. take or pressure is going to have? What effect do you think that's going to have?
Well, for the Ethiopian perspective, I think it would be appropriate to ask Ethiopian. So I would leave that for
that's fair.
Someone who's probably more qualified to answer that part. But for Eritreans, it's really you're either for the president or you're against the president. It's really a binary decision. There has been war propaganda, although it has been increasing, unfortunately, in the time since the conflict began, between those who stand to gain their own so-called revisionist history. They demonize their compatriots in Tigray simply for opposing the rule of Isaiah. It really centers around what his influence brings to the region. Isaiah knows that Eritrean refugees who flee from Eritrea into Ethiopia, most of them go to Tigray. And he sees that as a breeding ground for opposition. So those who are against the government of Eritrea, including myself, see this war as possibly the first in a series of check marks against Eritrea's sovereignty. Isaiah has been noted multiple times in allowing the Ethiopian government to use the ports of Assab and Massawa against the will of the Eritrean people. And I bring that up because there's never been an election in the history of Eritrea, and none of the economic or social developments in the country have been at the behest of the Eritrean people. It's always been seen as a way to co-opt the country's hard-fought struggle against the colonial power of Ethiopia. So there's a lot of historical resentment with regard to how Eritreans perceive this. For those who support Eritrea and the government, the Eritrean government, not trying to conflate it with Eritrea, they just see this as Isaiah's continuing what they see as victories. Whether or not they're justified, as long as there's someone in power who is winning, in their opinion, they are supportive of it. And it is quite sad to see that in order to be victorious in this region, you have to kill tens of thousands. And I would appeal to them and say, please stop supporting this government. Eritrea has been one of the most secretive and repressive states in the world. I could go into the fact that they were, this year, RSF ranked them as the country with the least amount of press freedom, even below North Korea. And that, again, goes into the issue of a lack of media transparency covering this war, which is fueling the misinformation.
Let me ask you this about the Biden's presidency on it, or the Biden's take on this. And for the standpoint of the misinformation, I mean, the thing is, from Western media standpoint, most of the information that has come out has just been echoing U.S. or, for that matter, Western perspective. That, ethnic cleansing is taking place, there are crimes that are taking place or are being committed, et cetera, with Ethiopia having a much smaller voice in that conversation about, pushing back on those claims. But I take your point. It's totally fair. And look, all of these wars, all things being equal, I err on side that it is probably taking place. The ethnic cleansing is probably taking place. I mean, even in the way that you explain it, this long, deep-seated resentment between the former war that has taken place, and now you have an Ethiopian government that is basically against the former rulers, if you want to call it that, but also is against basically the rulers who are basically the people who are fighting the war against Eritrea. So I get the point on this one, especially from the standpoint of press and from the standpoint of ethnic cleansing of past grievances. From the U.S. perspective and the sanctions that are potentially going to come out of this, I mean, the U.S. has thrown sanctions for pretty much everything, but the voices have gotten louder in condemnation. Does anything become of those loud voices of condemnation, not just from the U.S., but from other corners of the world?
Exactly. It should be noted that back in November, Abiy Ahmed said that this was an internal conflict of Ethiopia.
Right.
And the fact that he has reneged on that statement by admitting that Eritrean troops were in Tigray, it discredits him because he claimed multiple times that this was an issue that the Ethiopian authorities would be able to take care of. And involving the Eritrean military in this conflict significantly puts into danger or into risk the interests of, as you say, the West, the United States in particular, because Ethiopia is a key ally to the United States. They provide security.
Let me ask you this real quick. Why do you think he did that? Excuse me. Bringing in Eritrea, because you're right. There was a conflict. There was a war that was being fought prior. So bringing in basically the former adversary into a region that they were fighting in is problematic. Why would he do that? What would be his motivation? We have about 30 seconds. I'm just curious. Your take on it.
Sure. It's an adversary relative to who is looking. The TPLF see Isaias as an adversary because they were the former ruling party.
Right.
Abiy sees Isaias as a potential ally. And in doing so, he could strengthen his military support.
I see. All right. George, thank you for joining us, man. George Kadane is co-creator of English news startup Zena Netsnet that covers news, issues, and opinion related to Eritrea and the wider Horn of Africa. You can check out their work on YouTube with a search. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute.